In recent years, K2, once known for its isolation and deadly reputation, began to resemble Everest. With overcrowded routes, traffic jams at critical points like the Bottleneck, and an influx of less experienced climbers, the risks skyrocketed. As hundreds of climbers pushed for the summit, tragic events unfolded, leaving one porter dead and the mountain littered with controversy. K2's wild allure is being replaced by commercialization. But at what cost? Is the savage mountain losing its identity, or is something even more dangerous happening? Everest's overcrowding has become notorious, with long lines at the summit and traffic jams in dangerous sections like the Khumbu Icefall. Now K2 is facing similar issues. K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, after Everest. It stands tall and proud in the Karakoram range, in a remote part of Pakistan. It's always been known as one of the hardest mountains to climb. In recent years, more and more people have been trying to climb K2. It's not just for the super skilled climbers anymore. People with enough money and time are giving it a shot. But this caused some big problems. The mountain was getting crowded. The paths that used to be lonely and dangerous became packed with people. And when you have hundreds of climbers on a tiny icy path with deadly drops, things get risky fast. In 2022, a record 200 climbers reached K2's summit in a single season, with 145 making the ascent within just 24 hours. This overcrowding trend continued into 2024, with about 175 permits issued, bringing more climbers into the already narrow and hazardous routes of the mountain. The Bottleneck, K2's most perilous section, is now seeing the same kind of traffic jams that have plagued Everest for years, increasing the risk of accidents and delays in an already deadly environment. It's a narrow passage where climbers have to navigate a steep ice slope right underneath a massive hanging serac, an overhanging block of ice that could collapse at any moment. Many climbers have lost their lives here, and in 2023, it became the site of a tragic accident that shocked the entire mountaineering community. On July 27th, a long line of climbers was making their way up K2, all focused on reaching the summit. It was around 2:30 a.m., and they were navigating the Bottleneck in the dark, at an altitude of over 8,000 meters. Among them was a porter named Muhammad Hassan. He wasn't a professional climber. In fact, Hassan, a 27-year-old man from a poor village in Pakistan, had never climbed this high on K2 before. He had been hired by Layla Peak Expedition and was working alongside a rope-fixing team. Hassan's job was to help the experienced Sherpas set up the ropes needed for the summit push. But he was poorly equipped for the extreme conditions. Unlike the Sherpas, who had proper gear, Hassan didn't have enough protection. He wasn't wearing a helmet, his clothing wasn't warm enough, and he didn't have the supplemental oxygen that climbers use to survive in the thin air at high altitudes. But, like many porters, he was doing this dangerous job to earn money for his family, his wife, 3 young children, and his sick mother who had diabetes. Hassan needed to pay for her medical treatment, so he took the job, despite the risks. As the climbers moved through the Bottleneck, reports of avalanches began to spread. 5 avalanches were reported near the climbers during their ascent, and one even hit a group of climbers, but luckily no one was seriously injured. The conditions were bad, very bad, but the push to the summit continued. Climbers from multiple teams, Elite Exped, 7 Summit Club, Imagine Nepal, 8K Expeditions, and others were all in the race to reach the top. Everyone was focused on their goal, knowing they only had a small window of time to make it before conditions got even worse. Then, tragedy struck. At some point, Hassan lost his footing. Some reports say he slipped and fell into a crevasse. Others say he hit a rock. What we know for sure is that he fell, got tangled in ropes, and ended up hanging upside down off the side of the mountain, right in the middle of the Bottleneck, at around 2:20 a.m. He was left dangling over a deadly drop. The rope-fixing team, made up of experienced Sherpas, tried to pull him back up, but the situation was complicated. Avalanches were hitting the mountain, and everyone was battling the freezing cold and thin air. The Sherpas had to make the hard decision to keep moving. They couldn't stay there forever. They had to get to the summit and get back down safely. Meanwhile, other climbers were making their way up from Camp 3. In total, around 200 climbers were on the mountain that day, pushing for the summit. Many climbers passed by Hassan, seeing him hanging there but choosing to continue. After all, on K2, if you stop for too long, you put yourself in danger. It's a harsh reality of high-altitude climbing, but it's one that's been debated heavily in the wake of this tragedy. A few climbers did try to help. One of them was Gabriel Tarso, a photographer who was climbing alongside Norwegian mountaineer Kristin Harila and her team. They found Hassan still hanging upside down. His body was exposed to the freezing cold, and by the time they reached him, he had been in that position for over an hour. His stomach was bare, and he was barely conscious. Tarso and his team immediately jumped into action. They set up a pulley system, trying to pull Hassan back onto the path. After some effort, they managed to get him upright again, but Hassan was in terrible shape. His legs were likely broken, and he was severely hypothermic. His chances of survival were slim, but they still tried. Tarso gave Hassan oxygen, shared his gloves to warm him up, and even offered him warm water. But the storm was getting worse, and communication by radio was nearly impossible. Tarso and his team were running out of time and oxygen themselves. At around 5:30 a.m., as the sun began to rise, Tarso had no choice but to leave Hassan behind. He had done everything he could, but Hassan had become unresponsive, and there was no way to get him down the mountain safely. It was a heartbreaking decision, but staying any longer would have put more lives at risk. Tarso knew there was little hope for Hassan's survival. Hassan died that morning, alone on the mountain. His body lay there, exposed to the elements, while other climbers continued their push to the summit. Some climbers had to step over his body on their way up, which only added to the horror of the situation. After the news broke, the world was stunned. Mohammed Hassan's death sparked outrage and controversy. How could something like this happen? How could someone be left to die while others continued to climb, chasing their own dreams of reaching the summit? The mountaineering community was divided. Some believed that more could have been done to save Hassan, while others argued that on a mountain like K2, there are no easy answers. The risks are high for everyone, and sometimes decisions have to be made in the moment, based on survival. Hassan's death also highlighted the larger issue of how porters and local workers are treated on these expeditions. Unlike the wealthy climbers who come from all over the world to take on K2, many of the porters come from poor villages and are often underpaid and under-equipped. They take on dangerous jobs to support their families, but they aren't always given the same protection as the climbers they work for. Hassan was just trying to make a living, but he was sent up the mountain without the proper gear, and it cost him his life. The Pakistani government took action. They knew things had to change. In 2024, new rules were put in place to prevent something like this from happening again. The permit process became much stricter. The number of climbers allowed on K2 was significantly reduced to prevent the overcrowding that had become a serious issue in previous years. In 2024, Pakistan issued 175 permits for K2, a sharp decrease compared to the 207 issued in 2022. Out of these 175 climbers, about 50 successfully reached the summit, resulting in a 28% success rate, which is low even for K2, one of the toughest mountains in the world. Expedition companies now had to ensure that all climbers and porters were fully equipped with the necessary gear, such as oxygen systems and proper cold weather clothing, before setting out. This was a direct response to cases like Hassan's, where under-equipped porters were sent into dangerous situations without proper protection. These regulations aimed to prevent the tragedies that had occurred in previous years when climbers and workers lacked the proper gear or experience. The mountain itself was also given a break. Overcrowding had led to environmental damage, with more trash and waste left on the mountain. The new rules were designed to limit traffic, reduce waste, and give K2's fragile ecosystem time to recover. Despite these efforts, the demand to climb K2 remained high. The cost of climbing permits increased to $12,000 for a team of 7 climbers, with an additional $3,000 for each extra climber. Yet, this did little to deter wealthy adventurers eager to take on K2's challenge. But cutting down on permits wasn't the only change. The government also made it harder to even get a permit in the first place. Now, if you want to climb K2, you need to submit all kinds of paperwork, proving your experience and fitness. This led to delays and frustration for climbers and expedition companies alike. This wasn't just about safety for the climbers, it was about reducing the need for risky rescues that could put others in harm's way. Expeditions now had to include certified guides and support staff to help prevent accidents. The government also introduced strict environmental regulations. Every climber had to carry their own trash, including human waste, down the mountain. To enforce this, climbers had to pay a refundable deposit that would only be returned if they brought back all their waste. While necessary, this rule wasn't popular because it added to the already grueling climb. Expedition costs skyrocketed, with some agencies charging up to $85,000 per climber in 2024. This made it difficult for less wealthy climbers to participate, raising concerns about exclusivity. Additionally, fewer expeditions meant less income for local communities who rely on the climbing season for their livelihoods. But there were some upsides too. In 2024, new technologies came into play that made climbing K2 a little safer. Real-time weather forecasting tools became a crucial innovation, helping climbers predict storms, avalanches, and wind shifts several hours in advance. In the past, K2's weather was unpredictable, often catching climbers off guard. But with satellite data and high-frequency radios, climbers could now make more informed decisions, reducing the risks of getting trapped in dangerous conditions. Another improvement was in the oxygen systems used by climbers. These systems became lighter and allowed real-time monitoring of oxygen levels, helping climbers avoid running out of oxygen at critical points in the ascent. Additionally, climbing gear saw major advancements. Boots and thermal clothing were upgraded to offer better protection against frostbite and hypothermia, while also being lighter. Advanced materials like graphene and high-tech insulation fabrics helped climbers stay warm without adding unnecessary bulk, allowing for more flexibility and energy conservation. These upgrades made K2 climbs slightly safer and more manageable. While the improvements reduced accidents and the fatality rate, K2 remained one of the toughest and most dangerous mountains in the world. However, with these advancements also came some new challenges. The reliance on technology, for one, became a double-edged sword. Sure, it made things safer, but it also made some climbers over-reliant on their gear and gadgets. In the past, climbers had to rely on their instincts, their experience, and the wisdom of seasoned Sherpas who knew the mountain like the back of their hand. Now, there's a risk that people might trust their tech more than their gut, and on K2, that can be dangerous. Take weather forecasting, for example. It's helpful, but it's not perfect. Sudden storms can still appear, even if your app says the skies will be clear. Climbers need to balance their trust in technology with old-fashioned mountain smarts. The same goes for gear. Even the best equipment can fail. A tear in a thermal suit or a malfunction in an oxygen tank at 26,000 feet. That can spell disaster. At those heights, the margin for error is tiny. The rules that were introduced in 2024 were aimed at reducing accidents, overcrowding, and environmental damage. But not everyone loved them. Some climbers started to feel that all this new technology and the stricter regulations took away from the spirit of adventure that comes with high-altitude climbing. There was a bit of a divide in the climbing community. Some climbers were all for the changes, seeing them as necessary to keep people safe and protect the mountain. Others, not so much. They felt like climbing was supposed to be about self-reliance and facing nature head-on without relying on gadgets and strict rules. And that's where things got tricky. There's a growing trend toward ethical climbing in a way that respects the environment and the local communities. K2 is in Pakistan, and for the people who live in the surrounding areas, the mountain is sacred. Climbers are now expected to follow leave no trace principles, packing out all their trash, including human waste, to preserve the mountain's natural beauty. Respecting the local culture is also essential, as K2 holds spiritual significance for the people who live in the area. However, not all climbers agree with this shift. Some feel that the push toward ethical climbing takes away from the adventure and freedom that attracted them to the sport. Still, with more people attempting climbs, balancing adventure with responsibility is key to ensuring these mountains are protected for future generations. Even with all the advancements in technology and stricter safety measures, K2 remains as dangerous as ever. In July 2024, the deaths of two elite Japanese climbers, Kazuya Hiraiide and Kenro Nakajima, highlighted this brutal reality. They were attempting to scale K2's infamous west face, one of the most dangerous routes on the mountain, without oxygen, Sherpas, or fixed ropes. Despite their world-class skills, they tragically fell nearly 2,500 feet from an altitude of 22,965 feet. Due to the extreme technical difficulty of the terrain, no rescue was possible, and their bodies were spotted motionless by helicopter. The west face, successfully climbed only once in 2007, remains one of the most formidable challenges on K2. This tragedy, though heartbreaking, is a reminder that no amount of preparation, skill, or technology can fully guarantee safety on K2. But beyond these individual stories, something more concerning is happening to the mountain itself. K2, long known for its isolation and savage reputation, is beginning to resemble Everest. The influx of climbers, the commercialization of its slopes, and the overcrowding in critical sections like the Bottleneck mirror the problems Everest has faced for years. In 2024, around 175 climbers were granted permits, a reduction from previous years, but still enough to cause traffic jams in dangerous areas. With this overcrowding comes greater risk, delays, accidents, and environmental damage. Much like Everest, K2 is becoming a mountain where reaching the summit is increasingly a race against the clock, not just against the elements. K2's allure has always been tied to its danger, but as it becomes more accessible to commercial expeditions, the mountain's wild, unpredictable nature is clashing with the growing demand for adventure tourism. As more people flock to its slopes, the question becomes, is K2 losing its soul? And will the risks only continue to escalate as the mountain follows in Everest's footsteps?